Welcome to this Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University, and welcome to this conversation in the Observatorio. A conversation today about American Revolution, or at least Spain in the American Revolution. The Instituto Cervantes and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of Harvard University have created this observatory, this Observatorio. As you know very well, most of you at least, the Observatorio organizes and hosts seminars, conferences, debates, events, among other academic and cultural activities. This event today belongs to the series Conversations in the Observatorio. And in this conversation today, we are lucky for having two great historians with us, Professor Kathleen Duval and Professor Tamar Herzog. But we are also lucky for having a very special guest. He will be the moderator of this conversation, and he is a very, very well-known person, a very beloved person in this city of Boston. I'm talking about Julio Núñez Montesinos, Consul General of Spain. Julio Núñez Montesinos is a lawyer. He belongs to the Diplomatic Service of Spain since 1977. After serving in the Spanish diplomatic missions in Tanzania, Ireland, and the North Atlantic Council, in 1992 was appointed Deputy Director General for International Disarmament Affairs and Deputy Director General for International Security Affairs. Since 1996, Núñez Montesinos served as a Technical Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spain. In March 2004, he was appointed as Ambassador of Spain in Luxembourg, and since 2013, he is happily Consul General of Spain in Boston. So thank you, Mr. Consul General, for being here today and for leading us today. Thanks to our guest, Professor Herzog, Professor Duval, and thanks you all for being here. Professor, Mr. Consul General, do the honors, please.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, Paco, for your kind words. It's really a pleasure and honor for me to be here. I must acknowledge that it's the first time I try to moderate a conversation, especially having such an important historians like Professor Duval and Professor Herzog. So I'm going to just to start giving you some ideas about the curriculum vitae of both of them. And I will obviously stop there at the beginning, and they will be the ones who really are important here this afternoon, because they are each one on its particular field, a great specialist, which are going to illustrate us, I'm sure, in a very deep and interesting way about the subject of today's conversation. Of course, I'm going to sum up briefly the CVs of these two ladies, because they are so long that will be just the whole afternoon before I just go to the middle of any of them. So briefly, Professor Kathleen Duval is at present Professor of American History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, since 2015. Formerly, her education, she has a BA with honors in history by Stanford University and PhD in U.S. History, University of California, Davis. And she, before being appointed professor of American history, she was assistant professor and associate professor at the same university, North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is the author of 3 books. The first one, The Native Ground Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, 2006. The second one, Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America, 2009. And the last one, which appeared last year, and is very close to the matter of this afternoon, is Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, 2015. Professor Duval has written many articles on the matters she is interested in, which basically I would say, and correct me if it's not exactly, but I think that basically your interest is in the colonial part of the southern west part of the United States in the period just on the independence, the American Revolution, and she has written as well. She's in the process of writing some works in progress, and one of them is very, again, to the point of today's conversation. The title is "How Spain Won the American Revolution and Lost an Empire: The Life of Bernardo de Galvez." She has been invited to many talks, like the one this afternoon, and she has been talking about the subject of today concerning Bernardo de Galvez in many occasions. The education of Bernardo de Galvez at New York University, or Bernardo de Galvez, friend of the American Revolution, friend of empire, or Spanish ambitions and the American Revolution connected with that. And finally, I would mention that she is in her capacity of professor is acting, advising students right now. She has 3 students, graduate students. She's advising today in a very intense activity. One of them is Garrett Wright, the other Aubrey Lawford and Brooke Bauer, 2009 at present. So that's a little bit of the long CV of Professor Duval. And Professor Herzog, again, summing it up is the only thing I can do because it's so long. I mean, she started studying. She studied Princeton College at the United World College in British Columbia, Canada. She studied law, attended the law school, and then she was interested in Latin American studies and obtained a Master of Arts in Latin American studies. And afterwards, she moved to the École of Hautes Études Sciences Sociales in Paris, where she had a PhD. On all this time, she was writing books at the beginning of her early activity as a scholar, concentrating in the Latin American, and mainly in the administration of the old colonies, particularly in Quito. And after that, she moved to Madrid. She was professor of legal history at the University Autónoma of Madrid until 1996. And then she moved to the United States and was at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. After that, he moved to Chicago, and she became assistant professor of early modern history at the University of Chicago. And she was just sharing her work between history and law, and producing books at the same time. She is author of around 6 books up to now, if I'm not mistaken. After Chicago, she moved to Stanford. I was appointed professor of history at Stanford in 2005. And after that, she went all the ladder up before moving to Harvard in 2015 and becoming Monroe Goodman Professor of Latin American Affairs. She's interested in both law and history, and law and legal history. And she has written many articles as well, with book chapters in several books and languages in US, Canada, UK, France, Spain, Germany, Portugal, Brazil, etc. But I am not finishing her CV without mentioning that more important of all that, as she says, is that the greatest achievement to date is raising 11-year-old twins, boys, without compromising too often either intellectual ambition or life as a mother, wife, daughter, and friend. So I'll stop here. I was trying just to pull a little bit legs because she promised to pull mines at certain times, so I was just starting by doing that. Anyhow, thank you very much to both of you for being here today. I'm sure we are going to be really enlightened with your talk, and of course with the conversation following your initial talks. So please, Professor Duval, you can have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Instituto. Thanks to everybody here. And I want to say a special thanks to Gonzalo Quintero Saravia, who is, some of this work I'll be talking about today is from my previous book, some is from the book I'm sort of working on, but also a lot of it comes from an article that we co-authored together. So you should sort of picture him being up here some, and you'll see his name on a couple of the slides, I think, if I've remembered to give him credit, because some of the pictures are also from him. On April 12, 1781, 34-year-old Spanish general Bernardo de Galvez rode his horse through the camp on the north shore of Pensacola Bay. That same month, Charles Cornwallis was making his fateful decision to turn his army toward Virginia and ultimately Yorktown. At the same time, Galvez was trying to take a colony away from the British. His force of 4,000 white and black soldiers, sailors, and laborers were building fortifications, ferrying supplies from their ships, and setting up tents. Less than 2 miles away sat Galvez's next targets, the town of Pensacola and the fortifications that guarded it. Pensacola was the capital of the British colony of West Florida. So Galvez was in New Orleans, this is West Florida, and Pensacola is here. Pensacola was the capital of the British colony of West Florida. If he could win, the victory would be not only sweet for Spain, it would particularly trouble Britain, because West Florida was one of its colonies that was not rebelling. Losing it would raise the stakes for the already imperiled British Empire. Galvez had traveled by ship, canoe, horse, and foot over 4,000 miles from his home in the mountains of Andalusia in southern Spain, which I can't say with a Spanish accent. My Latin American teachers. If he succeeded in taking Pensacola, he would secure his reputation as a brilliant military commander and his future as a favorite of the Spanish crown. Ambitious Spanish men had served the empire for nearly 3 centuries since Christopher Columbus returned with glowing reports of the Caribbean islands in 1493. So Galvez followed an old tradition, but he was a new kind of colonial officer. As a man of the Enlightenment, he believed that the future of the Spanish Empire lay in rational, even scientific governance. And in the American Revolution, he was fighting against Britain. Still, Galvez was no friend of revolution, no friend of republicanism. He was a man of and for the Spanish Empire. Galvez and his king joined the American Revolution in order to support France and to take advantage of Britain's troubles. As the rebellious colonies fought a war against empire, Galvez led a Spanish war for empire, a war to win as much of the British Empire as possible for Spain. Never imagining that the war would threaten European colonialism itself, Spanish officials hoped to use the war to make the Gulf of Mexico a Spanish lake again. To Spain and to France, as to most of the world, the War of American Independence was just one of the multiple theaters of operations of a much larger, almost global war among empires. A war that would be fought in Europe, in Minorca, off the coast of Gibraltar, even at one point an attempted invasion of Britain itself by France and Spain, but also in the Caribbean, in India, in Central America, and of course on the North American continent. From the beginning of the conflict, the American rebels tried to persuade Spanish King Carlos III to join them against King George. Congress sent diplomats to Spain, adopted the Spanish peso as its currency. But the rebellious colonists were hardly natural allies for Catholic imperial Spain with its own American colonies to worry about. As a precedent, revolution was very troubling. Still, fighting against the British was tempting. The Spanish had been shocked at Britain's victories in the 7 Years' War, which had happened just a decade and a half earlier, including an invasion and a successful invasion of Havana itself. And at the end of the war, Spain got Havana back. But this, because France lost the 7 Years' War, this whole colony, which had been the French colony of Louisiana, both sides of the Mississippi River, so most of the middle of the North American continent, north of Mexico, France evacuated French Louisiana. The eastern half went to Britain, and they divided it into West Florida, which I mentioned earlier, Pensacola was the capital of, and East Florida, which they had gotten from the Spanish during the war. But the Spanish got the whole western half of what had been French Louisiana, including New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Combining these new lands of what was now Spanish Louisiana with almost all of the continent west of the Mississippi gave Spain claim to most of today's continental United States. But Spain had lost Florida, the peninsula of Florida, to Britain, and certainly wanted to reverse its rivals' gains in the East, in Canada, and in the Caribbean. Even before the war broke out, Spanish Secretary of the Indies, José de Galvez, sent spies to the British colonies to spy on both sides. Juan de Miralles spent years in Philadelphia sending back reports to the Spanish government about what was happening in between the British and their colonists, and even marching in parades every time the Congress got a new president and showing Spain's support, unofficial support for the revolution. Spain sent more troops to reinforce Louisiana once the war began, and also sent agents to recruit Indian allies from the Great Lakes to Louisiana to Florida in case there was a war. And the Secretary of Indies appointed his nephew, Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Louisiana. Almost immediately, Galvez began assisting the rebels. In spring of 1777, he sent the American commander of Fort Pitt, in what's now Pittsburgh, munitions worth some 70,000 pesos, along with a letter advising him to keep that help secret because Spain wasn't supposed to be involved in the war yet. In 1778, France entered the war on the side of the American rebels and pressured Spanish King Carlos III to follow through on his French alliance obligations and join in the war. As an inducement, France promised that the war would return Gibraltar to Spain and prevent Anglo-American settlers from expanding west and threatening Spanish territories. In 1779, Spain officially entered the war against Britain. Spain's war aims in North America were to keep Louisiana, and of course to keep Louisiana also as a bulwark against Mexico and the other parts of the Spanish Empire to the west and the south, to regain East Florida that it had lost to Britain, and maybe to get West Florida, that colony in between that had mostly belonged to France. So the Gulf Coast, to take the Gulf Coast and as far north as possible over the course of the war. The Spanish king had become entirely convinced that his empire could expand at Britain's expense, and he wanted General Galvez in New Orleans to take quick action. He ordered the governor of Cuba to assist Galvez with whatever land and sea forces it is possible to assemble in those dominions for an attack on Mobile and Pensacola, which the king called the keys to the Gulf of Mexico. The rebellious Americans were thrilled at Spain's entrance into the war. Thomas Jefferson had just been elected governor of Virginia, and he wrote Bernardo de Galvez that Spain's declaration, as Jefferson put it, has given us all the certainty of a happy issue to the present contest of which human events will admit. Jefferson can't write in just sort of simple language. He always has to make it sound like it's the end of the world. Late in 1779, Congress appointed John Jay to be minister to the Spanish court. Jay sailed across the Atlantic, eager to negotiate an official treaty of alliance between the United States and Spain. But Jay's hopes soon faltered. To the Spanish crown, John Jay was just an unsophisticated emissary of this little rebellious place. The Spanish crown did not officially recognize him or even at first receive him at court. Spain was fighting an imperial war, not for this upstart Congress. So General Galvez had his orders to take West Florida as soon as the war began. Now, West Florida and East Florida hadn't joined the rebellion, so the 13 British colonies were rebelling against the British, but not these two, and also not the Canadian colonies or the Caribbean colonies in the British Empire. These West and East Florida were heavily subsidized by the British. They'd only been British for a little while. Most of the colonists there were fairly new and dependent on the British Empire for building their farms and for their sort of ambitious dreams for the place. There was a pretty small European population in West and East Florida, surrounded by very powerful Indian groups, and they saw little reason to join in the rebellion. And then once the rebellion broke out, once the revolution broke out, loyalists, people who supported the British crown, flooded into East and West Florida from the Carolinas, trying to get away from the revolutionaries, so which made it even less likely that these colonies would rebel. So seizing West Florida didn't look easy. It wasn't clear that Galvez had enough regular army to take any of West Florida or even to defend Louisiana, because the British general stationed in Pensacola had exactly the reverse orders of Galvez's, which were to take Louisiana away from Spain. The loyalties of Louisiana's majority French colonial population were far from clear. It wasn't clear if they would fight on the side of the Spanish. Some of them had rebelled against Spanish rule only a few years before in the New Orleans Rebellion of 1768. Hardly any of them were actually Spanish. Despite schools set up to teach young men the Spanish language, most Louisianans still spoke it poorly, if at all, and definitely didn't identify themselves as Spanish. Just a few months earlier, Galvez had reported to his uncle that members of the New Orleans Cabildo, which was Louisiana's local governing council, were claiming, as he put it, imaginary rights in the governance of Louisiana. He wrote, "This body, composed of French individuals, maintains a spirit of rebellion and hatred for the Spanish nation which they cannot hide." Galvez despaired that he'd been working to try to convert them to being more Spanish, to being proud of being Spanish subjects for more than 2 years. He wrote, but without success. How could he possibly lead these people into battle? Galvez would need to persuade Louisiana's men and women, especially the French majority, that their hopes for independence and prosperity lay in Spanish rule. He needed to keep the king's, he decided to keep the king's declaration of war on Britain a secret for a little while. He sent orders to his commandants out in the posts along the Mississippi to prepare lists of their male inhabitants who might be eligible to serve in the militia. And he began secretly to improve the defenses of New Orleans and to get vessels that could transport troops. He invited Choctaws, Chickasaws, and other Indians to New Orleans to urge them not to support the British if war broke out. In August 1779, Galvez addressed the inhabitants of New Orleans in the Place d'Armes in front of the Cabildo building, which is now Jackson Square if you've been to New Orleans. He announced that the mail had brought an appointment, naming him Brigadier General. He said, "In order to accept the king's commission, I need to take an oath to defend the province." But he said he wasn't sure in good conscience if he could accept that role and take that oath. So the crowd he was speaking to murmured, how was it that he couldn't take an oath to the king? That didn't make any sense. So he assured them, "I would shed the last drop of my blood in sacrifice for my sovereign." So that wasn't the problem. He said, "Where I balk," he said, "was in swearing to defend Louisiana given the unfortunate state of the colony with the few troops that I have." He said, "It would surely be a hollow oath to defend Louisiana unless the people of Louisiana promised me to fulfill it." They took the bait. They showered him with effusive compliments. They assured him they were loyal Spanish subjects. And as he wrote, maybe inflating it a little bit, "They almost carried me in their arms to the Cabildo, forcing open the doors without waiting for the keys. Inside, they hailed him," he wrote, "with the greatest acclamations of joy and promised me they would sacrifice their lives in service to the king and do the same with their property." So a few days later, Galvez rode out of New Orleans alongside his officers with his regulars and his militia behind him. They recruited more followers in the French and American Indian communities north and west of New Orleans. And Galvez went personally to Havana to request more troops. So they took Manchac, they took Baton Rouge, they took Natchez, and in 1780, Mobile. And so all that remained was Pensacola. Galvez went to Havana to request more troops to take Pensacola. And by the spring of 1781, he had amassed more than 7,000 men to try to take Pensacola. During the delay, the British had reinforced the fort at Pensacola and laid in stores, but the British commanding general, John Campbell, would need American Indians' help. He had fewer soldiers than Galvez had, but he assumed that his Indian allies, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Creeks, would come to British aid. Campbell expected to have thousands of Chickasaw, Creek, and Choctaw fighters on his side. But his resources were limited, and Campbell didn't want to spend money on his Indian allies, which was a big mistake. Campbell tried to make sure that no Indians arrived to help him fight until he absolutely needed them, so that he wouldn't have to provision them when they came and pay for their time there. So 3 different times when Campbell thought the Spanish were about to arrive, he called his Indian allies to come from the hundreds of miles away where they lived, to come to defend Pensacola. And then he had to send them back, send a messenger back saying, no, don't come. It was a false alarm, when they'd already made most of the trip and expected, instead of being sent home, to be invited to come the rest of the way and be hosted and given supplies for their return trip home. Spanish delays meant that it was a year between between Mobile and Pensacola. So that's why these several false alarms happen. As the local British Indian superintendent explained, General Campbell does not understand anything of Indians or their affairs. He thinks they are to be used like slaves or a people void of natural sense. We thought he could just order them around, but it wasn't true. At the very same time, the victories that Galvez had won made Indians less excited about supporting the British in this war. As a result of both Spanish previous victories and Campbell's bumbling, only a few hundred Indians showed up in Pensacola to help when Galvez's fleet arrived in early March. The fleet, as the fleet was approaching Pensacola Bay, the naval commander refused to go into Pensacola Bay, saying that he thought the ships couldn't make it through the narrows at the mouth of the bay. Galvez thought that was being sissy. He had one of his officers go out and measure, and he thought he could make it. So it was Galvez who actually ended up being on the lead ship as they sailed into Pensacola Bay to take the post of Pensacola. A 61-day siege followed. And after some bloody fighting, the British commander raised the white flag and surrendered all of West Florida to the Spanish. Galvez went next to the Caribbean. He took the Bahamas and was preparing for an invasion of Jamaica next. At the same time, once he had won the Battle of Pensacola, his fleet that went to the Caribbean was able to relieve the French fleet that then went to Yorktown and helped to blockade the British from reinforcing Yorktown and helped the French and American troops there to win. So Galvez became a major hero in Philadelphia, in Madrid, and in many other places. King Carlos awarded him with the title Conde de Galvez, and wrote that, to perpetuate in your posterity the memory of the heroic action which you alone forced your entry into Pensacola Bay, and said you can put as a seal in your coat of arms the motto Yo Solo. So there he is, and Gonzalo, I think, are you who created this? helpfully pulled out of the seal the place where we see Galvez, somewhat inaccurately, alone standing on the boat, fighting his way into Pensacola Bay. Spain won. By the end of the revolution, Spain held the British posts along the Gulf of Mexico and on the eastern bank of the Mississippi. Look at its claims here. Despite the fact that these are different colors, this is all Spanish. So of course, Mexico is Spanish. California, this is an older map from when it was colored in 1792. So the shape of California is not quite right, but the coloring is contemporary to post the revolution. Mexico is Spanish, California is Spanish, all of New Mexico and Louisiana are Spanish, but so is all of this region. They have won some of it, it's in the treaty, some of it in battles, but their claims go as far as the Appalachian Mountains and the Great Lakes, right up to the border with Canada, with the United States only having the eastern seaboard. In the eyes of Spanish officials, they had succeeded in their war for empire. Of course, other people didn't agree with this map. Spain's claims include the very lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River that had sparked conflict in the 7 Years' War, Pontiac's War, and the American Revolution itself. So American maps at this period show the border more like here. And most of this region had never been controlled by Europeans at all, but was in the hands of Creeks, Shawnees, and scores of other powerful Indian nations. But the ambitions of the United States looked even less reasonable in the 1780s. The Continental Army's victory at Yorktown came with massive assistance from European allies. The new nation was still deeply in debt to the Spanish, Dutch, and French. Under the United States first government, the Articles of Confederation, the Congress had limited power to raise revenue because it couldn't tax income or property or even levy duties on imports and exports. Like the UN today, Congress could only ask its member states for money, and the states had little to give. No one even knew how big the US national debt was because so much of it was just in the pockets of men who lent supplies and money to the revolutionary effort. Indians from the Ohio Valley were raiding the western parts of the states from Tennessee to Pennsylvania. And many Americans imagined that the future would mean they shared the continent with Spain. Virginia Governor Patrick Henry in 1778 assured Galvez that the United States had more land than can be settled for many ages to come. After the siege of Pensacola, Congress resolved to hang a portrait of Galvez in a place of honor in the room where Congress met, which they finally got around to doing in 2014. Spain had joined the war to expand its empire, and it seemed to be working. To Spain, the American states were a little braggy, but weak and poor, as their continuing debts to Spain showed. Surely Spain could keep them in their place as dependent neighbors. The map of the continental United States today so neatly spreads from east to west, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that it would be easy to imagine that it was the country's manifest destiny to stretch from sea to shining sea. But these are concepts from much later in the 19th century. The national anthem, based on Francis Scott Key's 1814 Star-Spangled Banner, has no lines like that. In fact, Francis Scott Key was just hoping to hold on to Baltimore. Much more likely, I think, was a patchwork of European colonies and sovereign nations, which might include Spanish colonies, British Canada, the 13 states, either together or separately, multiple Indian nations, a pan-Indian confederacy or two, other newly independent colonies, and perhaps free black colonies under the Spanish or the British realm, which did come and go over the years. Whatever the configuration, in the 1780s it appeared that despite the changes of war, multiple sovereignties would continue across North America, as different kinds of people continued to ally and fight for what they saw as their independence and opportunity. And Spanish officials assumed many of them would choose incorporation into or alliance with the Spanish Empire. Any worries that the Spanish monarchy had had at the start of the war about the American Revolution being a threat to empires seemed disproven. Galvez's victories and success in inspiring loyalty among French and then British colonists in West Florida promised a strong and growing Spanish presence in North America. At the same time, Spanish troops had put down the Tupac Amaru and other rebellions in Spain's own empire, while in Europe, independent republics looked to be a dying breed. The independent states of Geneva, Sweden, Poland, and the Dutch and Venetian republics were seeming too unstable to remain independent, much less republican, while parliamentary reform had failed in England and Ireland. The Spanish couldn't see the future in the 1780s, but it looked like a good time to have an American empire.
Thank you very much for such an interesting, intelligible, and comprehensive exposition of this period and the action of Bernardo de Galvez in this context of the American Revolution. Thank you very much. It was really very, very, very good. And now is your turn. Thank you very much, Tamara.
So I'm actually not an expert on what I'm going to speak today, contrary to Professor Duval. So what I thought I could do is to say a little bit, so I've been reading, of course, to read a little bit what has been written on this subject, and then ask questions to which I basically don't have many answers, but I thought asking questions is sometimes important too. So here I go. The first question I asked myself as I was looking at this time is, what do we know about the Spanish contribution to the independence of the US? So I was just looking over books and articles and and websites, a lot of websites on that. And apparently, so in recent years, this had become a much more popular theme than perhaps before, thanks, among other things, of course, to the excellent work of our first speaker and other people that I hear. The works that had appeared really sought to complexify the image we have of that revolutionary period, as well as vindicate the role of forgotten individuals and forgotten agents, among them the Spaniards, who had contributed to help the rebellious colonies. To summarize what this research had said, is basically it highlights the role Spain played in the conflict and basically pointing to a few points. One, economic assistance, such as giving subsidies, loans that finance military operation, for example, the siege of Yorktown in Virginia, which many think was very important, perhaps decisive battle of the revolution, but also hiring foreign experts and backing the currency that the rebellious 13 colonies used, which was called the Continental. But Spain also helped the rebellion by giving commercial advantages to American ships going to Spanish ports, while blocking English ships from using the same ports. Spain supplied sometimes necessary goods, even ammunition, to the rebelling colonies, but Spain also started a second front, if you will, by fighting this war in the south against the English army, British army, that now had to face not only the rebellion colonies, but also Spain at the same time, and in Europe, keeping the British Navy busy with operation in Gibraltar and Minorca. So one of the questions this literature that describes these different pieces of Spanish aid has been doing is to ask why. Why did this happen? And I think there's a general agreement, a consensus, regarding the idea that basically if Spain did it, it was for self-interest. They weren't trying to help the Americans, they were thinking about their own. Spain, as also we heard now, saw this as an opportunity to get back at England, to get back territories that England received from Spain, maybe even get new territories. In her book, Duval argues it was struggle for rather than against empire from the Spanish point of view. According to this narrative, as far as Spain was concerned, the rebellion of the 13 colonies was an excuse rather than a cause. It was a means to take advantage of the situation. And as we just heard now in the talk, in the 70s, there's no reason to assume that the 13 colonies would be strong, would be important. And if you had to choose as a Spaniard whether you wanted Britain as a next door neighbor or the 13 colonies, you chose the 13 colonies because they seemed so miserable, so poor, so much without future, right? But then comes the question, I always tell my graduate student, this is the most horrible question professors can ask students, is the question of who cares? Why is this important? Why are so many people asking this question now at this moment of time? So for many people asking this question, what was the role of Spain in that conflict, has to do with getting the record straight, with highlighting the role of forgotten actors, making the story more complete. But for many others, and this is more, of course, noticeable in the websites that I was examining than in the books, the website being, of course, much less scholarly and more thinking about larger issues, at stake is also a political question. A wish to connect this story to the present and vindicate the role not only of Spain, but also of Spanish Americans, and Latinos in a longer history of the US, long before the US had become what we know it had become eventually, and long before Hispanics were dismissed, or their contribution had been dismissed very much as it is today in current US politics. I'm not going to speak about presidential nominees, I swear. So let me give you just one example. One of the websites I found as a historian most interesting anthropologically was one that is called ouramericanhistory.com, also available in Spanish as nuestrahistoriaamericana.com. This website, if you look at its homepage, actually says, and I'm quoting, "This is an award-winning website about the contribution of the Spanish and Spanish Americans to the 18th century American Revolutionary War. The site includes information on key elements and people in North and South America and Spain." It further states in that homepage that, I cite, "The website was created by Barbara Mitchell, a Hispanic American/Latina, with the mission to promote understanding and enjoyment of the Hispanic culture and contribution to our history. As the contentious immigration debate continues and as mainstream Americans struggle to accept and embrace a changing population, Barbara believes," I'm still citing from the website, "that fostering a dialogue of respect, knowledge, and shared heritage will make a profound difference." In this website, the author vindicates both her status as an American, she talks about the Independence War as our war, but also as a descendant of those Hispano-Americans that helped the US gain its independence. As part of her project of reinserting Spanish history to US history, the website also makes references, of course, to the early presence of Spaniards in North America, from Florida to Vancouver, from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake Bay, long before any English set their foot on the continent. It argues that the historical presence of Spain throughout North America is reflected in a number of key events, also in the American Revolution, but not only. Under this guise, the distance between past and present Spanish, Spanish Americans, and Latinos, of course, is either ignored or radically diminished. So what kind of questions would I ask from this literature and from what I just stated? How should historians react to such vindication? What can they make of the information at hand regarding the Spanish contribution to the independence of the US? How should they read it? So I'd like to say a few things, and as I say, it's more questions than answers because I'm really not an expert of that. So the first question, to which I already alluded, is the tying of President Latinos to those events that took place in the late 18th century, which involved Spanish, perhaps Spanish Americans. In what way are these the same groups? Of course, when we speak about Latinos today, we think about immigrants, recent or older immigrants who come from Latin America. When we speak about those Spaniards who aided the American independence, or Spanish Americans, we talk about people who stayed in their home place and sent supplies or money elsewhere. Second, from what we know about the Spanish contribution to the US independence, the story always talks about particular individuals. People like government officials like Galvez, but also a lot of merchants that were being middlemen that helped arrange for the loans, that helped send the weapons, send the supply, and so forth. So as a historian, my question would be, to what a degree could or should their activity be attributed to Spain, to a country? Or to what a degree were they helping the 13 colonies as a political entity? Or was it really a question of personal connections and ties and so forth? Of course, we must remember that whatever aid was given, it was not given to the USA. It was given to 13 rebellious colonies that nobody knew, as we just heard now, how things would transpire. It was a time of great upheaval, indeterminacy, in which present-day national borders we take for granted, both the existence of Spain and the US, of course, didn't exist. Neither there was a Spain, nor there was a US. At the time, as we just heard now too, I was thinking it was not at all clear whether all the colonies, all the British colonies in North America would rebel, and eventually we know that some did and some didn't. The most striking example, I think, is actually the Caribbean colonies that where the southern US colonies rebelled. The Caribbean colonies that are very, very closely connected with them do not. And what will happen? Will the rebellion succeed? We don't know what these colonies, 13 colonies, shared in common at this point, except for this wish for greater autonomy. We don't know whether they will form one country or not, and which form this country will take. So, of course, during this period, these people we now call patriots were rebels, right? There was no patria yet to be patriotic about. They were not yet Americans, they were English. who were seeking to modify the colonial pact that they had with the British authorities. And living next to them, and I was very happy you mentioned them, of course, were royalists that were just as patriotic. They loved their country, but they thought the best of the country would be to continue with Britain rather than to be separated. They too thought that they were protecting the interest of their communities and themselves. So under these circumstances, can we assume that position taking by individuals and even local authorities, governors, was national in some way? Or we can describe their action to countries rather than to themselves as individuals or leaders of a local community? What were they driven by? Self-interest, perhaps an ideology that had nothing to do with national or political belonging. As a historian of Spain and Spanish America, I was particularly intrigued in all this literature about the insistence that almost all the aid, if not all of it, came from New Orleans and Cuba. New Orleans and Cuba, of course, are two very different Spanish colonies. They both at this stage were kind of plantation economy, so they had a large population of slaves and plantation, but otherwise they were radically different. New Orleans was ceded, as we heard now, to Spain by France in 1762, so only a few years earlier. And the most important task that the Spanish governor had was precisely to win over the local French population, make them Spanish, introducing gradual changes, legal and political, to make the colony more Spanish than it was, less French. Cuba, of course, was Spanish colony from the 16th century, but it too was going during this period, the late 18th century, huge changes. It mainly functioned during most of the colonial period as a hub for navigation within the Caribbean, but from the 1760s, it was becoming a plantation economy. It started importing massively slaves from Africa and started moving to a plantation economy, eventually leading to the situation which by the mid-19th century, it was the most profitable of Spanish colonies and completely dependent on the sugar industry, providing, I think, as much as half of the sugar of the world or even more. So why New Orleans and Cuba? Where is Santo Domingo? Where is Mexico? Where are the other rich Spanish colonies? So what was exactly going on locally that would have these places rather than other places in Spanish America to collaborate? I don't know the answer, but it seems to me that there is a question there to be asked. So what I wanted to do in these few minutes is not so much to answer, as I mentioned, but really to decenter the narrative from this idea of countries collaborating into thinking about individuals and local communities collaborating. Especially in the case of Cuba, people speak about involvement of many individuals from Cuba. So what was happening at Cuba at the time? Who were the people? Why Cuba, as I say? Where are the other colonies? Why did the interests align in that way, and what did it mean? So present in my mind, and to finish my comments, is the fact that collaboration between individuals we now identify as belonging to distinct polities was part of the way the early modern world worked. And I'm an early modernist. I usually have this joke that when Napoleon arrives on the European scene, I leave. So I think early modern individuals really worked thinking about personal networks and local networks and not as kind of what we think today is national network. During this period, there was something we call a republic of letters that united individuals of different polities with one another, but there was also a republic of revolutionaries, of people who went around and dreaming about a better future. And I'm not going to go into the question whether they were right or wrong on what was the future they were dreaming about. And they were collaborating with one another because they had this common ideology of change. So to end my comments, I wanted to bring up one case of such a person that does belong more to, well, slightly to the Napoleonic period I don't particularly like, but the biography of Francisco de Miranda. So Francisco de Miranda, who was one of those member of a Republic of Revolutionaries and Republic of Letters, was a Spaniard born in Caracas, Venezuela. In 1771, he moved to Spain, where he was appointed as a military officer. After that, he was stationed in North Africa and fought in what today would be present-day Morocco. And in 1780, he was sent to the Americas. The following year, 1781, he participated in the successful siege of Pensacola. The same year, he was sent to Jamaica to secure the freedom of Spanish prisoners there, but ended up doing these very weird commercial dealings with the British, for which he eventually was accused of both smuggling, by the Spaniards, of both smuggling and even treason. Managing to delay his judicial investigation, the judicial investigation against him, Miranda remained in North America and eventually participated in the capture of Bahamas from the British. Under continuing threat of prosecution, he escaped to the 13 rebellious colonies. Passing through Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston, he ended up in New York. There he formed a network of connections, among other things. Listen to whom he had among his friends: George Washington, Thomas Paine, Alexander Hamilton, Samuel Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. There's nobody left that he didn't know. Finding against trouble, this time that an accusation that he was responsible to the failure to invade Jamaica, which supposedly the Spaniards were going to liberate from English rule. To avoid persecution, he takes off and sails to London, 1784. So he managed to do a lot of things in 4 years. In London, he meets and marries Abigail Adams, the daughter of John Adams, who was the American ambassador in London and became the second president of the US. He then started traveling widely in Europe, 1792, 1793, and then took an active part in the French Revolution. Why not? He was a general in the French Revolutionary Army, and for which he won a medal, and his name is in the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. After, he returns to London, and then he begins advocating independence for Spanish America. Of course, American Revolution, French Revolution, now Spanish America. He had a vision of creating this independent Spanish-American empire consisting of all the colonies, all the Iberian territories, including the Portuguese territories of the Americas, that would stretch from the Mississippi to Cape Horn. He had an idea of a hereditary emperor, which he was going to call Inca, in gratitude to the indigenous, or some symbol of indigenous cultures. To obtain this goal, and apparently with informal British help, he led an attempted invasion of Venezuela, 1804, and again 1806. He managed to conquer Coro, which is a city in the northern part of Venezuela, on the almost on the Caribbean coastline, but found no support from the local population and eventually was defeated by Spanish armies. Returning to the British Caribbean, he assembled a new task force, but events precipitated his action. The Iberian Peninsula was invaded by Napoleon in 1808, and eventually in 1810, the elites of Caracas actually declare their independence. He returns to Caracas, was chosen delegate for the first Congress of the Free Venezuela, and then he formally in 1811 is the one who actually declares the Venezuela a free and independent republic. So Miranda may have been exceptional in this global reach of all the possible revolution I can do in 10 years, but individuals like him were not altogether exceptional during this period. His engagement in all these events, of course, was not national. It was personal. It was ideological. It was fueled by personal connections, the networks he formed, by reading, but also by a vision that these revolutionary and emancipatory processes were not local, but instead a matter of concern to all individuals, be their nationality as it be.
Thank you very much for such an interesting and out of the mold exposition, and provocative, I would say, which is part of the whole exercise. So, thank you very much. I take it that my work here is just to start putting the whole thing in context and start asking some questions in order to provoke the debate. But of course, you have started doing that, so you have facilitated my task quite extensively. So I would start by asking one question to Professor Duval, and then going back with a question to what you have said. The question to Professor Duval is, well, the title of this conversation is Spain on the Edge of American Revolution. And I was somehow surprised by the word age, which means, what do you understand by Spain on the Edge of American Revolution, especially taking into account that one of your works in progress is how Spain, I mentioned that, how Spain won the American Revolution and lost the empire, the life of Bernardo de Galvez. So, which is, I mean, how do you see that? I mean, the age in which sense? And for instance, in which sense we could just talk at the same time that France was on the edge of the American Revolution? Could you just comment on that question?
Right,
please?
that's a great question. And so you may have noticed the subtitle of my book that came out recently is Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution. And in that book, I tell a lot of stories, but I closely follow 8 different people. And in an early version of it, Galvez was one of the people that I followed. And he still appears in the book a lot, but he stopped being one of my main characters in this book for the very issue that you're talking about. The other people I talk about are sort of mostly not very powerful people. They're women and American Indian leaders who are a little more powerful, but people who sort of tried to take advantage of the American Revolution from its margins and from positions of not much power. And he didn't actually fit my argument for that, because I think this is what you're hinting at. His war you could even say the American Revolution was at the edge of the imperial war that he thought of as the Revolutionary War, the war between, in fact, there are letters among different Spanish officers that refer to the war as the war, and this is before Spain enters, the war between France and Britain, with no mention of the colonial part of it. I think that this is a global war on which one might argue that the independence movement in the 13 British colonies was at the edge.
Of the imperial...
the war that mattered, the imperial war.
France,
right.
Spain, and
Right.
England.
Right.
Thank you. And well, taking from that and going to your point of view and the questions you ask, Tamar, I would contest that. Of course, I agree personally that you are right in saying that in the history we have to take into account personal action, personalities, groups which are not nations. But at the end of the day, and in the case of Galvez, which you could just say, or one could say that he was just asking somehow in a very personal way as well, at the end of the day, I mean, at the back of that, there is a nation. Probably there is the king, there is the superstructure, but there is a nation. There is Spain, who at the beginning gives money to the rebels, as the crown of Spain, that the crown of Spain is receiving some people from the colonies who are fighting for their freedom. The crown of Spain is the one who is providing the military people to fight in this war. So, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that there are persons involved in that, and there are ideological questions, as you mentioned with the question of Miranda, I think we cannot deny that there is a country there, at least a crown. I would say the modern sense of nation probably is not something that we can just extrapolate to that period of time. but there is a country, there is a nation, there is a crown, there is a government who is supporting that. Even if there are personal, particular interests of people who are fighting that, and they are doing that for their particular or personal interest. But I think we cannot deny that there is a nation that is in there. They will say the same thing as if we said that in the Reconquista in Spain, because there were different kingdoms, there was not something of fighting against the Arab so I wouldn't really completely agree with this. I think if you follow exactly what you are saying, you are taking out the idea that there is something else which is pivotal in the fact that there is a country, a crown, a kingdom behind that. I mean.
So I think where I'm coming from, of course, is as an early modernist, all my work so far has been precisely to ask, what is the early modern state and how does it function? So I'm coming from a long project, I'm actually coming from a long project of deconstructing what it means. What does it mean? You know, I've worked on citizenship, I worked on territorial conflicts, and I always trying to figure out who's acting, why they're acting, how do things happen, and what's the role of a state or a crown in it. So my comments come from that very strong belief that we have to decenter these narratives of nation and state in general. But even if you look at this specific case, so this is kind of a confession. This is what I do professionally. I look at these things and I ask these questions. But I think in this particular case, I think the king would have received emissaries and he would have done what he did according to his own perception of what's best for his kingdom. He may have sent to Cuba orders for Cubans to pay. But if Cubans raised money, it's because they thought it was the right thing. Because the king had absolutely no way of making people do what he wanted. The early modern state is not a police state. There are no soldiers. There are no soldiers, no Spanish soldiers in America. One of the reasons Spain loses the Americas so quickly is by the time the soldiers arrive, the America is gone. It's independent already. So there are no soldiers. There are local militias. There's no policemen. My first book, my dissertation 25 years ago, I was looking at how you had an administration of justice in a colonial city, in Quito. There was one policeman. So, you know, if you wanted order, you couldn't depend on one policeman. You had to get somehow the local society to collaborate with you. So the question is, why does the local society collaborate? How does the local society collaborate with you? Why do people obey? So this is what I'm saying. This is where I'm coming from. So if the people in Cuba, even if they received royal orders, decided to send money, there was something, it's not just their self-interest. There was something going on that we don't know, or I haven't found the answer. Maybe, you know, people who studied it know. That has nothing to do, in a sense, the king, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's true for Spain, I think it's true for many others too. He was a bit like God. Everybody knew he was there. It was very important to know he's there. He was the ultimate source of authority and justification, but he was not present. You just knew he was there, and people who fight locally always say they do it for him. He's a kind of a source of justification, but he's not physically there. He has absolutely no capacity to do anything. He doesn't have capacity to do things in Madrid, not to mention Seville, not to mention Havana. So my question is always, and it's not just self-interests, it could be ideology, it could be the local circumstances, we don't know, but it's not because the king said to Cuban elites, send money, that they send money. That's the one thing I know. But I don't know why they send money, but maybe Kathleen does. Yeah.
Rather than answer that question, to which I do not know the answer, I will say, with the, if you look at Galvez, I think it sort of brings these positions together. He wouldn't have been in New Orleans if the Crown hadn't sent him there. He wouldn't have invaded West Florida if the Crown hadn't ordered him to. On the other hand, he couldn't possibly have won, and therefore might not have even tried, might have said, yeah, sure, I'll invade, but put it off and not done it, if he hadn't been able to establish local connections and persuaded local people that it was in their interest. I mean, it's not really in their interest to fight for Spain, but Galvez, and to some extent the governor right before him, persuaded them. The Spanish Empire has the market connections, the slave trade, the protection against Indians that you need for the things that you already know you want here in New Orleans. And somehow, I think in part because he's an inspiring leader, he persuaded these French people that it was in their self-interest to take over British West Florida. And then when he got to British West Florida, he persuaded an awful lot of British colonists and French-speaking people who were still left from those regions being part of French Louisiana, that losing the British Empire wasn't a big deal, and that the Spanish Empire could provide for them even better than the British Empire could. And I think that's this sort of how power works, not from the top down there, but in these places that are so far from the metropole. It works through persuasion and bringing people on board, or failing to, which is the way it worked out sometimes, of course.
And actually, if I may say, this is precisely what is so striking, and I've seen it in my own studies too, that people do these changes. So you think they're French, they would go with France, but no, they're French and they would go with, because they didn't have that sense of nationality that was so much cultivated in the 19th and 20th century.
Yes.
So they did what would make sense to their local community. They could be very patriotic in the sense that they wanted New Orleans to do well, not just themselves. But the question wasn't being French because we're French and we need French. And so, people change loyalties from side to side all the time. It's very flexible.
I'm completely agreeing with that. I don't pretend that as I said, the Reconquista in Spain was the same as with the same concept as today we can think on Spain or any country, any nation. But what I'm trying to point out is that at least there is this connection, which in the case of Spain at that time is the king, the crown, which still is the one who really supports the whole structure, even if then the alliances changes and the personal actions are really very important, and sometimes they determine the whole issue of the fight or the war or whatever. Well, I think that's the moment we can just open to the public to just start putting some questions to both of you. So please.
Oh, hello. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that Spain contributes a lot, not just only from Cuba. I read a lot about all these issues. So I am from the South Spain. So in Alcalá de los Gazules, for example, they manufacture cannons that were sent to the rebels, gunpowder, uniforms made in Murcia, for example, from Bilbao, ships were sent to La Habana, and then from La Habana to New Orleans. And through Gardoqui was the first ambassador in U.S. So a lot of goods were sent hiding in the ships to La Habana and then to New Orleans. So Benjamin Franklin were in Europe, and I think Florida Blanca, the minister of Carlos III, had meeting with them. So I think Spain was very involved. Maybe at the beginning, just Bernardo de Galvez was informed to Spain, and he started everything. But after that, when Spain declared the war against the British, Spain contributed a lot. So I read an article that they did some calculation, and the equivalent, the help of Spain, the contribution of Spain to the American Revolution were $3 billion with the actual money today. So, and the other thing you said about there was no army in the area. So, for example, in Pensacola battle, we have the Batallón Fijo de Louisiana, Batallón de España, Navarro, Guadalajara, Mallorca, Navarra, Soria, Voluntarios de Cataluña, Batallón Fijo de La Habana. So there was a lot of army already in the area. So I don't think it was just help from La Habana to support. It was a massive project to help the rebels.
Thank you for that comment. Any?
Yeah, I would like to make a couple of comments too. Very good talks, by the way.
Yeah.
I agree with some of the things. For example, yeah, there was always an army. I mean, hundreds of years before these events, there was always army, and in this case, there were thousands of people from Spain, from the army of Spain, sent to. Yeah, you refer always to New Orleans and Havana, but there were 4,000 troops from Canary Islands sent to New Orleans from the Spanish army. So and many examples like this. I mean, troops, like he was saying, blankets, money, weapons, etc. And it was all as a country. Not, of course, individual efforts are important. Just like in today's world, companies at the end of the day, Apple, Google, they're moved by people and individuals like the ones we're talking today. But the effort is made possible because there's a company, in today's world. So so those efforts were possible because of Spain. Okay, and the last comment is that you mentioned also loyalties and how people change loyalties, but the norm is that you are loyal to one, two, maybe countries. But the example of the gentleman you mentioned, I mean, that's not the norm. That's the anomaly where you're loyal to first, Spain, Venezuela, France, England, U.S. I mean, that's not the norm.
Gonzalo.
Thank you. I would like you to go a little bit deeper into the reason why, because I think it's one of the most interesting ones. Why is this topic now becoming hot? Actually, because of the Latinos. That's it. They're trying to incorporate what it's felt about, like their history, into mainstream U.S. history. So how the figure of how the topic and how specifically the figure of Bernardo de Galvez is being used and to a very large extent abused by these interests that are over there. There are several confronting interests here. There's a part of the Latino community, but the Latino community should be sliced because it's very different from, depending which sector we're talking about. But also there's an interest in Spain and the Spanish government, in the Spanish society, in the Spanish politics, in using Bernardo de Galvez as something that has not been used before. The things that has been happening with Bernardo de Galvez in the last 3-4 years are not by chance or by accident. His portrait has been hanged 2 years ago in the Senate, but it was promised 200 years ago. He has been made honorary citizen of the United States. There are only 8 people who have been honored that. It has been honored only a year ago. So everything is happening right now. So how do you see this use of the topic and the figure in today? Because it's hot because there's something new that wasn't before. Thank you.
You should answer it too, not me. But I think there is something going on, and this year, or was it last year, we had a panel here with Fernández Ernesto that has this book that also reivindicates Spain in the Americas. So obviously politically, and I think you're right that it's coming both from Spain and from the Latino community here. But as a historian, personally, I'm much more interested in the question that Professor Duval was asking. That is, if you see the map, I want to know what happened. I want to know how these 13 miserable colonies, if I may say, ended up taking over. Where was Spain? That's what, as a historian, I'm interested on. Not to say the Spaniards were the first one to be in Florida or the first one in California. You know, who cares, in a sense? You know, it's nice, fine. But my real interesting question is that, and actually American historians haven't answered it yet. They say things that are commonplaces, you know, whether it's because, and it's not Kathleen in general, they say, obviously the Anglos won over. They were so much better, they were much stronger, their system was, whatever it is, that sense of superiority. But it's a really interesting question. And I find that fascinating. So if I was a historian of the US, that's what I would be writing right now, personally. And I found it striking. So I was in LA a few months ago, and I went to the museum, the Municipal Museum of LA, which is in USC. It's a fascinating piece of anthropological work. I'd love to know who curated there. And there's a history of LA which starts with the Spanish conquests and all the missions there, goes on next to the conversion of the indigenous by the Spaniards, and then to the formation of this amazing local community of Spaniards. Then they become Mexican. There's absolutely no explanation how Spaniards become Mexicans. And the next thing, they're on these Anglos, and there's no explanation what happened. But in the moment they portray the Mexican period, which is very, very small, right? In California, this is funny, I was at Stanford, so they always say this was a Mexican territory, and I kept on saying, no, it was a Spanish territory and Mexican territory, nothing. But there are all these Mexicans there, and they show that the mayor of Los Angeles is Mexican, that the elites of Los Angeles is Mexican, they're the richest inhabitants, and all these poor immigrants come from the East. And then you tell the story of the poor immigrants from the East and how much is success. And there's just like gaps in this story that nobody explains. And that's the story. If I was in the Spanish ministry of whatever, that's what I would be after. I want to know what happened, and I want to know how it happened. And last example, I can tell you, I just finished to write a book of legal history. New Orleans. So New Orleans eventually becomes part of the US. We know that. So I was looking at what happened legally in New Orleans. We all know, those of us who know something about law, that New Orleans is French law. That's the only country, the only state in the US that has French law. Well, it doesn't. It had Spanish law, actually. And when you look at the history of New Orleans, it's Spanish, and then it's being Franchised after it goes into the US. It's an amazing story. There was Spanish law, and then after the US takes on, they start saying we're French, and we move from Spanish to French law. There's something really strange going on. Go for it.
Okay, great. Wow, there's a lot I want to say there, and I'm sure I won't remember it all. But I remember going to New Orleans for the first time and going to the French Quarter, and it was going to be all French, and then all the names are Spanish. All the architecture is Spanish. It's not French.
It's like California, Mexico, New Orleans is
It's French, yeah, French, and both as sort of what they started calling themselves. Some of them started thinking of themselves after they became part of the United States, right? No, no, yeah. So I think just from the perspective of why historians are particularly interested in these stories these days is, I think, especially among people who study the early United States or the colonial period before the United States, but are U.S. historians. There was finally, a few decades ago, a recognition that the study of the early United States had been extremely parochial, that it had focused in large part on New England and Virginia, maybe occasionally paying a little attention to South Carolina or Pennsylvania, and that this whole continent was part of the story of the colonial era, and it had gotten very little attention from either Latin Americanists and certainly not from the people who call themselves Americanists, but really are just USonians. And so that in the last few decades, that study has really broadened and has become interested in a variety of different kind of people. So French colonization and Spanish colonization, American Indians in all of their variety and from their various perspectives, and enslaved people, and more on women than in the past. And so I think some of this is just that kind of looking at the bigger world and what it looked like to people who lived in it, more than historians had in the past. And the piece of my CV where it says the title of the book I'm working on, I'm still pretty early on it. So actually what I've been thinking about is for that book and how to talk about Galvez, but in a you know, and how exactly to do that. I've been thinking about, I've so thoroughly convinced myself that the 19th century is going to be a Spanish century in North America, and I'm wrong, it's not going to be, that question, I think, may be the central question of this next book. Why? First, you know, telling many readers for the first time that it was more likely to look, that the continent was more likely not to be all the United States, and then to explain why that happens. And I think I'm thinking about using the Andrew Jackson to show. Andrew Jackson was somebody who, right after the Revolution, negotiated along with his neighbors to possibly become part of the Spanish Empire or to establish their own Republic of Tennessee, allied with the Spanish, away from the United States. And yet within 20 years, he becomes the man who illegally, without orders from the United States at all, invades Spanish Florida and ends up taking Spanish Florida for the United States. And I don't know the answer, but that's a good way to start a book.
I don't know if I have questions or maybe reactions. And you have raised many questions, but there are maybe bigger questions. You know, just your charter have made me think about who writes history. That's a big question. Is it the crown that writes history? Is it the one in power? Are the generals who write history? Are the victors the ones who write history? Or are the people who write history? Or the individual people in their ideologies and their emotions and their motivations write history? So there's the big question in history, who writes history? And what I'm thinking right now that in this process of maybe rethinking histories and creating new legends, and who is promoting creating the new history that you're talking about maybe reinventing or rethinking the role of Spain during the American Revolution. Now I have another question that you didn't mention. Was there any role in the religion here whatsoever? I mean, none of you have mentioned religion. It's such a big. So you either talk about economics, writing history, talking about politics, writing history. Or religion, were the Jesuits some place around? Were no religion involved? No Protestant, no Catholic. No. I just wondering.
So I think that I should probably let you talk more to the bigger issues of this, but one of the things that the Spanish promise as they go into, say, British West Florida, which has a lot of Protestants in it, is to recruit them into the Spanish Empire. They say, you can't practice your religion publicly anymore. What you do at home, we won't mess with. And there's some struggle to decide whether that's okay. So that's the offer that they make. And then the Spanish officials, when they write to each other, they say, the second generation will be Catholic. This first generation, they're not going to learn to speak Spanish. They're going to still be Protestant or whatever, but eventually they'll be Catholic. But then it's also it's a time in the Spanish Empire where they've well, I'll let you talk about that instead.
Because they expelled them, right?
Yeah.
So they're not here.
Right.
They're not Jesuits, but there are other Catholics, but Jesuits. It's not the only Catholics, but the Jesuits not there. I think that it might explain why the French would go with the Spanish, because they're all Catholics. And I also think that looking globally at the Spanish Empire, the interest and the focus on conversion is much diminished by this time. In my last book, I was looking at the interior of South America, the Amazon, and it's very clear that they moved to this idea of alliance with indigenous nations without forcing conversion, with the same idea that, Catholicism is so right that they will see the light, it's only a question of time. So there's a really great faith in it will happen. But whereby before, the first thing you did as a Spaniard when you went in the indigenous village is to try to convert, or at least mass baptize, without explaining, who cares? Now you do treaties, and you say, come settle next to me, let's do commerce, and eventually down the line, they will convert. So I think there is a much more of, maybe because of the colonial experience, which shows clearly that a quick conversion is impossible and maybe not worthwhile. But anyway, there's much more of a sense of, on the one hand, assurance that it will happen, but on the other hand, tranquility as well, that doesn't have to happen the first day.
Well, as a matter of fact, we are in the 18th century. It's a century in which the religion questions are somehow differently approached. Please, sorry, no.
Thank you so much, both of you, all of you. This is wonderful. I think I grew up as a product of the parochialism that Kathleen Duval was talking about. And it's one of the reasons I became interested in Spanish history, is because it was such a revelation to me to look at it from the other side. But what I'm wondering is, in the 13 colonies, how does this major role of Spain play? How do you get from the Black Legend, from, papists being the devil incarnate, to thinking about Spain as an ally in the 18th century? And are there testimonies? Is there are there personal diaries or letters, things like that, that actually give us access to what people like my ancestors in Newburyport and Northwest Connecticut might have been thinking about the Spanish? Because I was really indoctrinated by a grandmother who was a daughter of the American Revolution and very disappointed that I would not consent to be such a thing. And nothing about that narrative had anything to do with Spain. Mm-hmm. So I think that's terribly interesting, and more interesting now that I hear you.
Well, I think that as they rebelled against Britain, I think sort of in some ways the confluence of the Enlightenment and Revolution deciding to rebel against their own empire made it easier for many Americans to do what, you're exactly right, was a very dramatic switch from a couple centuries of demonizing, particularly the French, but also the Spanish, and Catholicism being part of that demonization, to seeing them as allies. From what I've read, and I must say it's mostly actually not diaries of people on the ground, and I think that would be a great research project, from leaders and sort of mid-tier leaders in the States. They switch pretty quickly and easily to imagining that this is an alliance that makes sense if they're going to fight the British, and I think they just have to. Many of the same men or their sort of subsequent leaders switch back to demonizing the Spanish as being backwards in Florida, and the issue of slavery comes up a lot in the justification for invading Spanish Florida, that the Spanish welcome slaves, they free slaves. I mean, we know the Spanish Empire is full of slavery and these sugar plantations and everything, but there's a reputation that the Spanish free slaves, and therefore they're not a good neighbor. I would be fascinated to look at diaries in New England of people and the descendants of people who'd had wars against French Canada that were brutal and remembered, and to see if they switched over that easily or not. I wonder. Yeah.
I actually wanted to say something in defense of my colleagues who do history of the USA. So it is true that they have been very parochial, but it is true for all national histories. So, we just discovered that, in Latin American history, it wasn't the independence of my country, it was a global thing, and in fact was tied to the Napoleonic invasion in Spain. Spaniards have, I don't know if all of them have recently discovered that not only Spain, but also Portugal was invaded by Napoleon, and there was a war of independence there too, kind of, sort of. Anyway, the French Revolution used to be a property of France, and now suddenly we know that it was a much more global phenomena. So I think, fair to say, this is something that historians, which makes sense because history as a profession was born in the 19th century in order to form nations and justify this crazy idea, excuse me, that there are these things and that they're natural, right? To the degree that now we think that they are. It's a great success. But now that we succeeded, historians, and I'm talking about my forefathers historians, in convincing everybody that they're nations, now we're doing the opposite work of saying, wait a minute, it's not so simple. These things were global, this was larger. So I think it's happening everywhere. It's not just U.S. history. Wherever we grew up, all of us, we grew up with a parochial national history. I can put my hand in the fire. And we're all moving, in all these countries, we're moving away. So
Because we are in a global area, and the word of the day must be global and not particularly national, probably.
Partly it's globalism, but I don't think it's only globalism. I think it's also the disenchantment with the idea of nation and what nationalism has produced in the 20th century. I think there's a lot of things going on, not globalism too, and the idea that the nation state isn't a unit anymore. But I think also disenchantment with globalism, a much more, at least in some places, much more international community of scholars that speak to one another. I think it's very hard. If you just sit with American historians in an American university, you can maintain this fiction. But once you have colleagues who are doing other stuff and you go to conferences and you meet, but I think it really is a global phenomenon. It's not just a US field. I love it, of course, because suddenly they think we're important, right? Suddenly those of us who do Spain and Spanish America matter. But I actually force all my students to learn a lot about the U.S. because I think the colonial America has a lot to do with Spanish history too. So it's both ways.
It occurs to me that it would be fascinating to have the reaction to this of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, our colleague, and what would be the what kind of a record in the history of objects in circulation how would you see the whole interaction between the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world, and she's done such a beautiful job with with English and colonial and Indian and so on. But where do Spanish objects figure, for example, and
So I can tell you long time. A few years ago, when I was still at Stanford, I heard a talk by an American historian at Berkeley that was working on Boston and the mint in Boston and currency in colonial Boston. And one of the things that really shocked me, he kept on saying about how all the currency in colonial Boston, or most of it in circulation, was Potosi and Mexican. They actually used the Spanish peso as the local currency here, mostly. And then they decided they didn't want it anymore, and they instituted the mint because there wasn't enough English currency or whatever. And then when they did the mint, they actually imitated the way the Spaniards coined their coins, at least in the beginning. So there's a whole scholarship out there, objects, about the importance of currency from Mexico and more from Potosi in the economy of Boston, colonial Boston. Or as they say here, Boston.
Any other question? And I think we'll, on the point of...
One last question.
Yes, one last question because we are over time already.
Yeah, Professor Herzog was talking about what happened with 13 colonies moving west, but that's a really complicated answer. I mean, but and it wasn't in a year or 10 years. It was over hundreds of years that was settled, and it was settled even when up to 100 years ago in the Spanish-American War and Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and those stuff. But I wanted to ask you, so because Spain also was it was a world war, right? So, and you mentioned too, one of the factors there was that you mentioned like Napoleon invaded Spain. So if you're invaded, your country is invaded, then this becomes irrelevant because it was only 10 years after that. Then, so one of the reasons was that. But I wanted to ask you.
I think that's right. I think the one-word answer to your question would be Napoleon.
When Napoleon comes in. But I wanted to ask you because before Spain entered the war, as far as I've read, etc., Spain was dealing with England. Like, should we, there was a lot of tension. Should we declare the war against, England and join the U.S. and France? And there was a lot of back and forth because Spain was interested in, Honduras, Venezuela, Menorca, Gibraltar, all this stuff, more important than any of this other North American wild stuff. So, and their main thing was always like, there was even I read that there was a letter that it was sent from Spain, like to England, like, okay, if you return Gibraltar, then we will not join the war. So do you think that if Britain would have returned Gibraltar, it would have changed the history?
So at the very same time that John Jay was in Madrid trying to get an audience with the king, with anybody from the crown, there was an English minister there secretly, or English emissary, unofficial ambassador there, trying to negotiate something to keep Spain, get Spain right back out of the war before any battles even broke out. And I don't think just Gibraltar would have done it, but they didn't come to an agreement that both sides would accept. And of course, Gibraltar is the one thing that Spain didn't win, right? But yeah, I think there's definitely a scenario in which they would have said, forget about the Floridas, we don't care about any of that, and taken everything else that was it.
Seeing that from today, it will be probably a very right move from our side. Okay, I think we have to again thank our two historians here for a very interesting, very good, and very provocative and stimulating session, the conversation. So thank you very much for your participation, your ideas, and your knowledge. So thank you very much.